In the Slavic world of Central and Eastern Europe, there exists the legend of three brothers, Lech, Czech, and Rus. The story begins while on a hunt with their tribe. When they reached a set of plains and rivers, Rus told the brothers that his people were tired and they would settle there, thus becoming the founding patriarch of Russia. Czech and Lech continued westwards towards the setting sun. Soon they came upon a set of mountains. Watching the sun rest upon the mountain peaks, Czech stated that his people would settle there, thus becoming the founding patriarch of Czechia. Moving north, Lech came across a beautiful white eagle, in a land of rivers and fertile soil. Watching as it perched in front of the red setting sun, Lech decided to make his home there, and so begins the story of Poland. After the fall of the Romans and throughout the 9th century, the land between the Elbe and Dnieper rivers was often considered to be fractured and uncivilized, although this was only a perception. The Slavic tribes that inhabited the land lived in small settlements, each part of a relatively self-sufficient larger community. Czechs, Slovaks, Moravians, Mazovians, and Polonia lived in the area. And, of course, there were many more. There were also many religions and local cults, which held sway over the land. These religions were neither organized nor a politically driving force, which is wholly ironic given how Poland is today. This all changed in the 10th century. The Piast dynasty had come to power in the Polonia settlements and had taken control of much of the surrounding area. This is the first record we have of a Polish kingdom. In the travel record of Jewish merchant Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, we see the development of the kingdom under the Prince Mieszko. Much of the formerly quote-unquote uncivilized settlements had developed a strong, complex trade economy that shared a very sophisticated political network. It wasn't actually uncivilized at all, it was just a different system for most of Europe. That being said, by the mid-1900s, many kingdoms and domains have been carved out by the local rulers, including one formerly prince, now king, Mieszko. Now, remember all those small religions? Remember how they weren't organized and didn't hold much power over the land? Well, here comes Christianity. Otto I, King of Germany, crossed the Elbe River in 955, attacking local Slavic forces until he came upon Mieszko's domain. To avoid war and to connect his kingdom with the rest of Europe, Mieszko finally converted to Christianity in 966, officially beginning the Kingdom of Poland as we know it today. Although, if you really expected Mieszko to sit down and be some obedient godchild, you were sorely mistaken. Mieszko does what Mieszko wants, and what he wanted was the Baltic coast itself. Unfortunately, so did the Magarv of the Northern March, who was attempting to conquer it for the Holy Roman Empire. At the Battle of Gdynia in 972, the Magarv was defeated, and the Poles took a warpath to destroy the rest of the Northern March order in 976. This was maybe not the wisest choice, as Otto II was now in charge of the Holy Roman Empire, and soon had his forces marching east in 979. So, what did our intrepid King Mieszko do in such a time of crisis? He turned his army right back around, marched south, and then defeated Otto in the same year. Poland has been officially a kingdom for less than 13 years, and has spent 7 of them at war with the Holy Roman Empire, a war which they won. By all means, King Mieszko was kicking off Poland with a bang. People were hearing of his feats as far as Cordova in modern-day Iberia, and he was well known across the land. By the time of his death in 992, his son Bolesław took the throne. He took to Christianizing the kingdom, and all seemed well until the year 1000. You see, Poland up until this point was existing in some sort of a limbo, with having connections to the HRE, but operating completely on its own. King Otto II was fine with letting Poland be the eastern bulwark of the empire, but when he died, his successor Henry II was much less enthusiastic about the prospect. Henry decided to crush Poland on all sides, a tactic that will be used to great effect in the future. However, Henry was a couple hundred years too early this time. The Germans marched from the west, the Slavic tribes from the north, and the Czechs from the south. However, with a heavy sigh, Bolesław, a man much like his father, picked up his sword, and he proceeded to beat Henry in battle. Then he would secure an alliance with both Hungary and Lorraine, in turn pressuring Henry on all sides. He quite literally took Henry's plan and used it against him. After reorganizing the western border with some light conquest in the east, Bolesław promptly up and died in 1025. Seems a bit anticlimactic, but I'm not one to judge. This turned out to be terrible, as his son, Mieszko II, turned out to be nothing like the grandfather he was named after. His jealous brothers overthrew him in 1031, with the help of Kiev. He was then able to regain it in 1034, but died in the same year. The country was extremely divided at this point. It looked like the history of Poland might end here. Only to make things worse, the Czechs decided it was high time they marched to Gniezno, seize the Polish crown jewels, and make off with the body of one Saint Adalbertus. In 1050, the Germans got the idea to conquer Poland again. As you will see, this habit never seems to go away. However, Poland finally managed to get their shit together under King Kashmir the Restorer, as he restored faith in the Polish monarchy and moved the capital to Kraków. He also made so many alliances, the Germans kinda decided it wasn't worth the trouble and backed down. Unfortunately, despite Kashmir's reign, things did not improve much from here, as the reigns of the next two kings only saw Poland further fracture into many duchies, despite technically remaining unified. What came next is very hard to speak about for lack of accurate records. We do know there seemed to be many conflicts in Pomerania, but not everything was as bad as it might seem. Not only the capital of Kraków, but cities like Kalisz, Wrocław, and Poznań flourished during this time. Poland also received large amounts of immigrants in terms of Germans, Jews, and Czechs. This continued until the early 13th century. In 1241, the Mongol armies finished up their absolute takeover of the Kievan Rus. That makes one of three brothers now turning in their grave. The Mongols, as you know, were some of the finest war wagers in history. Fast-paced, disciplined, and experts at siege warfare, they were a truly terrifying army from the heart of Central Asia. The Polish, however, stood tall at Khmelnyk, where they were promptly swamped and massacred, because if it was that easy to beat the Mongols, they wouldn't have reached Kiev. Kraków would be subsequently sacked and burned. A second Polish stand would end in a similar fate before the Tartars veered south to join their brothers who were already sacking Hungary. Only with the news arriving that their Khan was dead, did the Mongols finally leave well enough alone. However, they would return both in 1259 and 1287 to put Poland to the fire and sword once again. However, with the Polish fortresses becoming more resilient over time, the Mongols would find it harder and harder to gain ground, and became set on ruling the Rus instead. So far, Poland's last 200 years have been quite the mess, but it is about to change with one of the greatest kings in Polish history. He's lean, he's mean, he's a fighting machine, it's Władysław the Short. His actual epithet given to him by history is Władysław the Elbow High, but for the sake of brevity, we're just going to call him the Short. He was crowned king in 1295, but was forced to flee 5 years later in the year 1300 due to a Czech invasion. Władysław would then spend the next 6 years in Rome of all places gathering allies. With what troops he could muster, he marched back to Poland, seized Kraków in 1304, Gniezno in 1314, and was finally re-crowned the King of Poland in 1320. Now that takes some serious gut. His entire army was a cabal of volunteers, a few allied supporters, and anyone else that was willing to help, and it took 20 years for him to finally return and be crowned king once again. And finally, after constant years of warfare and occupation, in 1333, Poland was finally able to catch a break. While Eastern Europe was completely devastated by a minor ice age that ruined harvests and caused famine, Poland remained mostly unaffected. And while Western Europe was tearing itself apart in the 100 Years' War, Poland was experiencing a time of peace. When the Black Plague arrived in 1348, Poland was one of the only places with limited to no effects. While the entirety of Europe burned around them, Poland was finally able to take a breather. While the populations of England, France, Italy, Scandinavia, Hungary, and Germany were all cut in half, Poland was the only one to actually grow in size. As an added bonus, all the anti-Jewish sentiment in the rest of Europe caused many refugees to flee eastward. The Jewish population often found a more accepting home in Poland, which would remain their nation for centuries. And I say more accepting because synagogue burnings and anti-Jewish sentiment was not unheard of in Poland. It was just less common than the rest of Europe. Kashmir the Great was a fitting ruler for these times. He reorganized the court, funded universities across the kingdom, and encouraged a flourishing art and architecture movement across his lands. He also more than doubled the size of Poland. In 1345, he decided it was high time he take back Silesia, and with that settled, he turned upon Mongol-ruled Russian principalities in the east. For the next 25 years, Kashmir would slowly march his way south. The power vacuum this left allowed for the rise of a land that would soon become very important in the near future, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Lithuania had always been surrounded by enemies, and while they had managed to carve out quite a large chunk of Eastern Europe for themselves, they were still vulnerable. Poland was also in a precarious situation. When Kashmir died, he left the throne to his nephew, the King of Hungary, and when he died 12 years later, in 1382, with no male heir, Poland once again prepared for a century of turmoil. Luckily, no such century was to come, as the 10-year-old Jadwiga was crowned the King of Poland. I have honestly no idea why she was crowned king and not queen. It most likely seems to be a snub to the Habsburg prince who was supposed to take the throne at the time, but no one is 100% sure. As was custom, Jadwiga was to be married, and there were two main options: the aforementioned Habsburg, who was German and inbred, or the Grand Duke of Lithuania, who literally ruled Lithuania. I'm pretty sure you can guess which one she married, thus beginning the Polish-Lithuanian Union. In 1409, the Polish-Lithuanian alliance came to blows with the Teutonic Order to the north. The Teutons had long been a source of tension. They had seized the territory of Gdansk in the chaos of Władysław the Short's reconquest of Poland. Now, with a new resurgent alliance on their doorstep, the Order attempted to bring civil war to Lithuania by supporting a cousin of the current duke to become the regent. This ultimately failed, but by the time it did, the Order had already moved into the Zamoyski province. The Lithuanians drove him out in 1409, and a truce was signed a year later, but that wasn't to be the end of it. In 1410, the Lithuanians and Polish pooled their forces and marched against the Teutons. At what is considered to be one of the most important battles in Polish history, the alliance smashed the Teutonic forces, at a battle between the towns of Grunwald and Tannenberg. The Teutons would make war again a decade later, and then once again in 1453. Each time, the Teutons were spared by the HRE intervening, although by 1466, the Teutons had moved their capital to Königsberg and became a vassal of the Poles. The following 15th century was one of the highest points in Polish history. The victories over the Teutons had secured them a point as one of Europe's greatest powers. Major advancements in science would come with the birth of Copernicus and many others. And in terms of territory, they controlled land from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and from the fields of Hungary to the lands of Russia. In this time, the Polish parliamentary system, which had been in place since the 1300s, was strengthened as well. In 1493, the government was split into two governing bodies, the Senate and the Sejm. A new legal system would also be established around this time, with a system of courts not too dissimilar from the one we have in the US today, although they would possibly be more in favor of the nobility. It is 15th century Europe, what did you expect? However, Polish democracy was fundamentally flawed. Keep this in mind as it will come in later. Although, Poland-Lithuania's solidified economic system did allow for the growth of the economy, causing a major boom of growth across the empire. Poland was also one of the most diverse places in Europe, at this point being a mix of Poles, Lithuanians, Ruthenians, Germans, Italians, Jews, and so many more. In the early 1500s, however, cracks began to show. The formerly Lithuanian Jagiellon dynasty had control over the states all over Eastern Europe. However, after the Battle of the Mohawks Plains, the Ottoman capture of Belgrade would weaken their position in the Balkans. To add to the threat, with the weakening of the Golden Horde in the latter half of the 1400s, the Muscovites would rise and rally the Russian principalities under their banner. The only other power to rival them in the area was the Crimean Khanate, which was a puppet of the Ottoman state, and so the Poles were yet again surrounded on all sides. As the first half of the 16th century came along, more and more power in the Polish government fell to the Szlachta, the groups of Polish noble families in Poland-Lithuania. This was great for the nobles, but not so great for the kings. However, the Szlachta was often the best way to represent the common people, as it was a diverse caste making up 10% of the population. Being in the Szlachta was similar to being a Roman citizen at the time of the empire, a fair size of the population who was treated with the highest civilian status possible. In the 1560s, things heated up between Poland and its neighbors once again. as Ivan the Terrible would make excursions into Lithuanian territory, causing mass amounts of panic and civilian loss of life. In the light of this, and the complicated mess that was the Polish-Lithuanian government, both kingdoms' nobles met in 1569 to officially unite under one crown. The current king of Poland, Sigismund II Augustus, would be elected as the first king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The new government that was formed was one of a, quote, royal republic, with the king holding the most amount of power, followed by the Senate, and with the Sejm being the least powerful governing body. The 16th century was relatively uneventful in terms of wars and power struggles. Other than the quick period where the Commonwealth entered into a 5-year union with Sweden, and the aforementioned war with Ivan the Terrible, Poland was by all means in its golden age. This golden age promptly ended with the turn of the 17th century. Sweden had long coveted the territory of Livonia, which was under the Commonwealth control at the time. Charles IX would attempt to seize it, but the Swedish forces were crushed, and Charles died, leaving the throne to one Gustavus Adolphus. Luckily for the Poles, Gustavus was pretty preoccupied, so Poland-Lithuania was able to hang on to Livonia. This was until Poland lended 10,000 cavalry troops to the HRE, which helped them win the Battle of White Mountain in the 30 Years' War. Seeing this as, quote, treachery, Gustavus would invade the Duchy of Prussia in 1627, where he would be surprisingly defeated, and an official peace would be signed in 1635. This, however, would only serve to further the feud between the Swedes and the Poles, which would come boiling over in the next century. Also, as a side note, the Poles would occupy Moscow for a full 2 years in the Polish-Muscovite War. Just something I thought I'd add as a high note before we talk about the relatively depressing upcoming events of the next century and a half. In the 1630s and 1660s, multiple Cossack rebellions ravaged the Commonwealth south. A particularly bad revolt in 1648 by a man named Khmelnyk spilled over into a 2-year bloodbath in what is modern-day Ukraine. King Vladislav IV, the only man the Cossacks respected, died and was replaced by Jan Kashmir, who managed to subdue the Cossacks, but not without a severe loss of Polish lives. And from here, things only got worse. Yet another man by the name of Khmelnyk would gain power over the Cossacks. This time he would ally himself with the Tsar Alexei of Russia. They launched a joint invasion in 1654. The Poles called for aid of the Swedish king, Charles X, who launched an invasion of Poland instead in 1655. By September, only Lublin, Gdansk, and parts of Lithuania continued to hold out. The Swedes would rob Poland of everything it had. Paintings, sculptures, jewels, and all manner of art was taken and brought back to Sweden on ships. By 1657, Poland had been retaken with the help of the Dutch and the Danish. The Swedes took Livonia, and the Cossacks would end up with nothing. The Commonwealth had originally thought out the possibility to add Ukraine as a third governing body, but in 1660, when the Cossacks would once again ally themselves with the Russians, the Poles would beat them into submission and left it there. There would be no more Ruthenia within the Commonwealth. Although the Russians would end up taking Kiev in 1667, finally ending the Commonwealth's reign as the Dragon of Europe and a great power. The last truly momentous victory of the Commonwealth began in 1683. Sultan Mehmed IV of the Ottoman Empire invaded Austria and laid siege to Vienna. King Jan Sobieski, a brilliant man and a career soldier, signed a treaty to aid the Austrians in their time of need. In the Battle of Vienna, the Polish winged hussars led the charge, slamming into the Ottomans and driving them away from the city. This, however, would do little to revive the Commonwealth. Dying in 1697, Sobieski's plans to conquer Prussia and retake the lands from Russia would never come to fruition. Poland was a society galloping towards its own destruction. The Great Northern War would be disastrous as the Swedes occupied much of the Commonwealth, with a Swedish puppet being placed on the throne. Even though they were ousted in 1709 and King Augustus returned, it would be a terrible look both internally and internationally. In 1718, Poland-Lithuania became a Russian protectorate. The War of the Polish Succession in 1733 only further divided the country, and the new king, Augustus III, would be completely incompetent. The final king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was brought into power in 1764. He was a former lover of Catherine the Great, the Russian empress. Aptly named by historians as Stanislav the Last, he would preside over the nation until its downfall. A rebellion in 1770 to dethrone the puppet of Catherine failed. This would culminate in the First Partition of Poland. Land was forcefully ceded to Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Reform was clearly needed. In 1778, a new legal system was put into place. In 1789, a new republican constitution was overwhelmingly adopted. Famous writers such as Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke praised it, while the Russian minister Herzberg states that Poland could become a threat in the future once more. However, Catherine the Great thought this was extremely dangerous, bordering on revolutionary. So in 1792, the Second Partition of Poland was put into place to prevent them from ever rising again. This was, to put it lightly, too much. In April of 1794, Wilno rose up under the command of Colonel Jakub Jastrzębski. He would go to liberate both Warsaw and Kraków, however, it was doomed to fail. A combined Prussian and Russian army crushed the revolutionaries. By now, the three powers saw it fit to do away with Poland indefinitely, and so Russia, Prussia, and Austria carved up the last bits of the kingdom in the Third Partition of Poland. However, this is not the end of Poland's story. Part 2 will be up as soon as possible, where we will continue until the modern day. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe if you have not done so. This is the History Broadcast, signing off.